So let's just jump right in. What, Roger, to your mind, is the problem with moral relativism?
Well, there is an intellectual problem as to what it is. What does a moral relativist believe? He obviously believes that moral judgments do not have any kind of absolute force, but what follows from that? Are they relative to something? If so, to what are they relative? That's one problem. And there's a huge discussion in the literature about this, very inconclusive discussion. But the real problem is what it means to ordinary people who don't have the philosophical training and the philosophical inclinations that some of us have, who nevertheless hear this expression, moral relativism. They hear phrases like, it's all relative, or that there are no absolute values, or that any judgment that you make is your judgment from your point of view, there's no objective point of view, and so on. These are all garbled versions of philosophical positions, but they are very influential on ordinary people, and have given rise to the feeling that really in the end there is no point outside the individual's own perspective from which he can be judged. He can only be judged from within his own perspective, in terms of his own desires, ambitions, aims, and so on. And which means that judgment becomes a kind of impertinence. And as a result, of course, people cease to share any conception that they are joined in a common enterprise.
Right. Maybe in just a few sentences, what exactly is moral relativism, and maybe you can put it in sort of layman's terms, and what's been its unique contribution to Western thought?
Well, I would say that in layman's terms, a moral relativist is somebody who believes that a moral judgment is the expression of the subjective opinion of a particular person, and that it cannot be evaluated from any other position than his own. Mm-hmm. So every judgment is relative to the interests and position of the person who makes it. So that in the end, there is no position outside the individual from which he can be judged.
Right. So then maybe an older view of thinking or philosophy or of approaching life would have been an endeavor to discover truth, or something like that.
Yeah, obviously one contrast with this is the religious worldview, which says that there is a position outside the individual's interests from which he is judged. That is the position occupied by God, who, as it were, provides that overview, systematic overview of all our desires and all our aims, and is in a position to judge us. We can then, by, as it were, discovering what his position is, come to an objective view of our own situation. Right. Obviously, the obvious thing to say about moral relativism is that it's what is left when the religious worldview collapses. And that's perhaps one reason why it is so prevalent now.
Right. Do you have to have, though, a religious worldview? Would an Aristotle have viewed it that way? Do you necessarily need to be religious to recognize that truth might exist and it would be worthwhile to discover what that is?
No, you don't. And of course, that has been one of the efforts of philosophy down the centuries. Aristotle is only one example. Kant is another. The effort to produce a fulcrum on which our worldview can turn, which is not simply our individual desires. And I think for a long time after the Enlightenment, Western intellectuals believed that they had discovered that in the idea of morality put forward by Kant, or perhaps some version that was downstream from that, like the utilitarianism of John Stuart Mill and so on, which gave a secular grounding to a shared moral position, which would not be the position of any particular person, but the position of all of us. And from that, we could come to conclusions about what was right and wrong, which didn't privilege the individual and his desires. But of course, I think there's been an increasing, during the 20th century, an increasing despair that that project was possible.
Right.
This despair had many forms, but one of the most important from the point of view of rhetoric was the existentialist position of people like Sartre. Sartre said, he argued that there is no position from which I can be judged except my own. So that the only thing that can authenticate my moral judgments is my choice that those are my judgments.
Right.
So the difference between a moral and an immoral person, on Sartre's view, is simply that the moral person is somebody who wills his own desires as commitments, whereas the immoral person is someone who just has those desires. So on that view, the authentic existentialist rapist is the one who you should praise, not the person who simply is tempted by his sexual appetites.
Right. So this subjective understanding of truth, where I can't necessarily judge your value system or whatever else, we're told that this has led to an age of toleration, and yet a lot of those folks who espouse, I think, maybe a postmodern moral relativist view, use the words ought and should and must quite a bit. So how do we arrive at that, sort of a didactic moral relativism?
It's a very good question. That it is obviously a part of human nature to affirm ourselves through moral judgments. And when people adopt the view that all moral judgments are relative or subjective, they turn that into an objective morality too. So it becomes a kind of sin to be other than a relativist. You know, and you see this happening especially in things like the European Court of Human Rights, where when you find people with old-fashioned objective systems of values constantly being called before the judges and reproached for the fact that they are discriminating against people who don't share their values. Right? So it becomes ever more difficult to retain those old-fashioned objective views of what morality is without being condemned on moral grounds for having those views. So that a kind of subjectivism becomes a moral norm. So it's not that people have really given up on the idea of objective morality, it's that they're making a certain kind of subjectivity into an objective morality. It's a kind of paradox, and you see this paradox already in Nietzsche, and people like that who Nietzsche affirmed this, something like a subjectivist view of morality, that what matters, he says, is to will your own desire as a law. You know, it's your own desire and the will to power that is expressed through it. That's the essence of the moral position. But of course, Nietzsche very quickly turned that from a doctrine of liberation into a doctrine of condemnation. Condemnation of all the people who couldn't live in that way and needed the support of an objective framework.
Right.
And I think you're finding that happening now in the kind of moralism that surrounds the European enterprise. I suspect that this becomes obscure because very often modern moralism clothes itself in the concept of a human right. You know, the idea of universal human rights is a sort of political expression of the 18th century Enlightenment morality, especially it grows out of Locke and out of Kant, and it is what we have retained in the modern world of that noble effort to construct an objective morality without God. You know, and this morality had the form of a respect for universal human rights that we all possess by virtue of our human nature, and which we can affirm against each other, we can lay claim to them, and expect others to acknowledge that claim. Yeah, so it gives a fulcrum outside the individual desire on which the issue can be turned. But it all went terribly wrong, in my view, after the Second World War, when people lost any sight of what the list of human rights consisted of. Originally, in people like Locke and also in Kant, human rights are fundamentally negative things. You know, a right not to be interfered with, not to have your life taken away, not to have your freedom taken away, not to have your property taken away, and so on.
And these would have been ideas that the American founding would have been rooted in.
Essentially liberal ideas.
Right.
And it's a sort of axiom of that way of thinking that your right is my duty. So if you have a right, I have a duty towards you to respect it. If your right is simply not to be interfered with, it's easy for me to fulfill that duty. Mm-hmm. I don't interfere with you, I don't kill you, take your property, enslave you, and so on. But with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights after the Second World War, all kinds of new rights came into existence, or they didn't come into existence, they were postulated by the process that then was initiated, including the right to have a job, the right to have security of home life, the right to have sufficient to cover the basic needs of existence, the right to health care, and so on. And gradually this list of rights expanded. These are not freedoms, but claims. They're very different. It's not a freedom to go about your business undisturbed, but a claim that people are given against each other.
And that claim is rooted in what? A communal desire for...
Well, at the time, it was part of the whole move towards a more socialist conception of the state. Because once you make these claims, if you hold on to the axiom that my right is somebody else's duty, you automatically have to answer the question, well, whose is the duty to provide? Right. And of course, it's not the duty of any particular person, it becomes the duty of society, which is another name for the state. Right. And so it led to a massive expansion of the state's embeddedness in human relations. Whether this was a good thing or a bad thing is, of course, part of the disputes in politics to this day. Mm-hmm. And it's one of the things which separated liberals from socialists. But irrespective of whether you think this is a good thing or a bad thing, it clearly involves a radical change in our conception of what a right is. A right becomes a claim that we can each make against each other. Right. Of course, then this tends to undermine people's sense that there really is any objective authority to the idea of a right. When somebody comes along and says to me that he has a certain claim against me, even though there is no relationship, I tend to think of that as nonsense. And so there's this confusion about the idea of human rights means that there's a considerable amount of nonsense embedded in our legal systems.
Right. In a political order sort of founded on this idea, where rights are sort of dictated or coming from the state, if you feel like you're a victim of nonsense, what can you appeal to?
It's a very good question. And people, let me give you an interesting case. In my country, we have a very important tradition of planning law, which was arose